The dust had barely settled on Main Street when Mason Lawson rode into Opal, Wyoming with $3 in his pocket and no intention of staying past sunrise. It was late July in 1883, and the heat hung over the small mining town like a wool blanket someone forgot to shake out. Mason's horse, a paint mare named Juniper, picked her way carefully over the rutted street, her ears swiveling at every sound. The town consisted of maybe 20 buildings total, most of them leaning slightly to one side as if they were tired of standing upright. A saloon called the Silver Nugget occupied the largest structure on the main thoroughfare. Its painted sign faded but still legible in the orange glow of the setting sun. Mason had been riding for 6 days straight, working his way north from Colorado after a cattle drive that paid less than promised. At 26, he had spent the better part of 8 years drifting from job to job, town to town, never planting roots anywhere. His father had died when Mason was 17, leaving him with a struggling ranch in Texas that he sold within a year, unable to manage it alone. His mother had passed when he was just a boy. Since then, the saddle had been his only real home. He tied Juniper to the hitching post outside the Silver Nugget and stretched, feeling his spine crack in 3 places. The saloon doors swung open as a miner stumbled out, already drunk despite the early hour. Mason stepped around him and entered the establishment, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. The place smelled like whiskey, tobacco, and sweat. A piano sat in one corner, currently silent. A handful of men occupied various tables, playing cards or drinking in sullen silence. Behind the bar stood a heavy-set man with a magnificent mustache that curled at the ends. But it was the girl weaving between the tables with a tray balanced on one hand that caught Mason's attention and held it. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with hair the color of honey that she had pinned up in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, both clean but clearly worn from years of use. What struck Mason most were her eyes, a green so vivid they seemed to hold their own light source. She moved with efficient grace, delivering drinks and dodging wandering hands with practiced ease. Mason found himself standing in the doorway longer than necessary, just watching her work. She glanced up, caught him staring, and raised an eyebrow in a way that was more amused than offended. Heat rushed to his face, and he quickly moved to the bar. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Whiskey and whatever food you have available," Mason said, placing 2 of his 3 precious dollars on the scarred wooden surface. "And I am looking for a place to stable my horse for the night. Whiskey I can do right now. Food will be ready in about 20 minutes. Dorothy makes a decent stew most evenings. As for the horse, Anderson runs a livery 2 buildings down. Tell him Frank sent you, he will give you a fair price." The bartender poured a generous measure into a glass and slid it across. "Just passing through." "That is the plan," Mason said, taking a sip. The whiskey burned pleasantly down his throat. "Any work in this town? I might stay a day or 2 if I can earn some money." Frank shrugged. "Mining mostly, but the companies have their regular crews. Sometimes the ranches outside town need extra hands, but this time of year most are set. You might ask around tomorrow morning." He paused, studying Mason with eyes that had seen plenty of drifters come and go. "Where you headed?" "North. Maybe Montana. I heard there might be ranch work up there." "Long ride still ahead of you then." Mason nodded and took another sip of his drink. The girl with the honey-colored hair approached the bar with her empty tray. Up close, he could see a small scar above her left eyebrow and a dusting of freckles across her nose. She smelled faintly of lavender soap. "Table 4 wants another round, Frank, and the Burke brothers are getting rowdy in the corner. You might want to keep an eye on them." Her voice was lower than Mason expected, pleasant and warm like heated molasses. "I will handle it," Frank said. He glanced at Mason. "This is my daughter, Grace. Grace, this fellow is just passing through, going to have some supper." Grace turned those remarkable green eyes on him, and Mason felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that he had not realized was closed. She held out her hand and he shook it, surprised by the firm grip. "Welcome to Opal, Mr. Lawson. Mason Lawson. Just Mason is fine. Just Mason, then." A small smile played at the corner of her lips. "I hope our humble establishment meets your standards. We may not be Denver, but we keep things relatively civilized most nights." "It seems just fine to me," Mason said, and meant it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary, then turned to refill her tray. Mason watched her go, admiring the straight line of her spine and the confident set of her shoulders. Frank cleared his throat, and Mason quickly returned his attention to his whiskey, feeling like a schoolboy caught passing notes in class. The stew, when it arrived, was indeed decent. Mason ate slowly, making it last, while he observed the evening crowd. The Burke brothers that Grace had mentioned were getting louder, their argument escalating from whatever small grievance had started it. Frank moved out from behind the bar with surprising speed for a man his size and said something quiet to both men. Whatever it was worked, because they settled down immediately, though they continued to shoot dark glances at each other. Grace made her rounds with tireless efficiency, somehow managing to be friendly without encouraging any inappropriate behavior. Mason noticed the way she handled the more difficult customers, deflecting crude comments with quick wit and maintaining her dignity without making enemies. It was an art form, really, and she had clearly mastered it. When she passed his table again, he found himself speaking before he could think better of it. "How long have you been working here?" She paused, considering whether to engage in conversation. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she answered, "About 4 years. My father bought this place when I was 18. My mother had just died and he wanted a fresh start somewhere new. I help him run it." "I am sorry about your mother." "Thank you. It gets easier with time, though I still miss her every day." She shifted her empty tray to her other hand. "What about you? Any family?" "Not anymore. It has been just me for a while now." Something like understanding passed between them, that recognition of shared loss that needs no further explanation. Grace nodded slowly. "Well, I hope you enjoy your stay in Opal, however brief it may be." She moved on before he could respond, but Mason felt the absence of her presence like a sudden chill. He finished his stew and nursed his whiskey, in no hurry to leave the warm glow of the saloon for the dark street outside. Eventually, though, he knew he needed to tend to Juniper and find somewhere to sleep for the night. He paid for his meal and stepped out into the evening air. The temperature had dropped considerably, the desert cooling rapidly once the sun set. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, more stars than he had seen in months, unpolluted by city lights. He found Anderson's livery easily enough and paid 50 cents to have Juniper fed, watered, and sheltered for the night. The stable owner was a laconic man who asked no questions and offered no conversation, which suited Mason fine. With his saddlebags over his shoulder, Mason walked back toward the saloon. Frank had mentioned that they rented a couple of rooms on the second floor for travelers. It was more expensive than Mason wanted to spend, but sleeping in the open with only 50 cents left to his name seemed foolish. At least in a rented room, he could lock his possessions away and get a real night's rest. Frank was alone behind the bar when Mason re-entered. The evening crowd had thinned slightly, though a poker game was heating up in one corner. I would like to rent a room for the night, Mason said.
This
$2,
story was
Frank
posted on the
replied.
channel The Rusty
That includes
Saddle. Please
breakfast
do
in the
not
morning.
repost it in any
Room 3
form.
at the top of the stairs is open. Mason hesitated. That would leave him with absolutely nothing in his pocket, but the exhaustion in his bones made the decision for him. He handed over the money and received a key in return. Thank you. I appreciate it. You look dead on your feet, son. Get some rest. Things always look better in the morning. Mason climbed the narrow stairs at the back of the saloon, finding room 3 easily enough. It was small but clean, containing a bed, a washstand, and a chair. A window looked out over the back alley. He dropped his saddlebags on the chair and sat on the bed, testing it. The mattress was thin but infinitely better than the hard ground. He should have felt content. He had shelter, food in his belly, his horse was cared for. But instead, he felt strangely restless. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened buildings of Opal. Somewhere down below, Grace was still working, still moving between tables with that efficient grace. He could hear the muffled sounds of the saloon through the floorboards, voices and laughter, and the occasional shout. Mason undressed down to his union suit and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would find work or move on. That was how it always went. He never stayed anywhere long enough to form attachments or make real connections. It was easier that way, safer. He could not lose what he never had. But as he drifted toward sleep, it was green eyes and honey-colored hair that filled his thoughts. He woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up from below. For a moment he was disoriented, then remembered where he was. Opal, Wyoming. One night only. Time to move on. Except he was completely broke now. He would need to find at least enough work to buy supplies before he could continue north. The realization should have frustrated him, but instead, he felt a small spark of something that might have been relief. Mason dressed quickly and headed downstairs. The saloon looked different in the morning light, less romantic and more worn. Frank was behind the bar and Grace was setting plates of food on one of the tables. 3 other men, clearly miners based on their clothes, sat eating breakfast. Morning, Frank called. Find a seat. Grace will bring you some food. Mason chose a table near the window and sat down. A moment later, Grace appeared with a plate laden with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread. She set it in front of him along with a cup of coffee. Sleep well, she asked. Better than I have in weeks, Mason admitted. Thank you, you are welcome. She lingered by his table and he got the sense she wanted to say something more. Finally, she spoke. My father mentioned you were looking for work. There might be something if you are interested. Mason looked up quickly. What kind of something? Our handyman quit 2 weeks ago. Took off for the gold fields in Montana. We have a list of repairs that keeps getting longer. It would only be a few days' work, maybe a week at most, but we could pay you and provide room and board. What kind of repairs? Mason asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. The porch out front is loose in places. Several shutters need repairing. The storeroom door does not close properly. The roof over the back entrance leaks when it rains. Nothing too complicated, but things that need attention from someone who knows their way around a hammer and saw. She paused. My father is good at many things, but carpentry is not one of them. Mason considered. A week in Opal would put him behind schedule, but what schedule did he really have? No one was waiting for him in Montana or anywhere else. And the prospect of spending more time in Grace's presence was more appealing than he wanted to admit. I can do all those things, he said. I would be happy to help. Grace smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. Wonderful. I will tell my father. When can you start? As soon as I finish breakfast. Perfect. She turned to go, then looked back over her shoulder. I am glad you stayed, Mason. He watched her walk away, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Just a few days, he told himself. Just long enough to earn some traveling money, fix a few things, and move on. That was all. But even as he thought it, he knew he was lying to himself. After breakfast, Frank showed him the various projects that needed attention. The list was longer than Grace had suggested, but Mason did not mind. Frank offered him $3 a day plus room and board, which was more than fair. They shook on it, and Frank directed him to a shed behind the building where tools were stored. Mason started with the front porch, replacing loose boards and reinforcing the support posts. It was good, honest work, and his hands remembered the skills his father had taught him years ago. Several townspeople passed by during the morning, most offering a friendly greeting. Opal seemed like a decent place, small enough that strangers were noticed but large enough to have some amenities. The mining kept it alive, Frank explained during a water break, though the best veins had been tapped years ago. Now people were just scratching out a living, hoping for one more big strike that probably would never come. Grace brought him lunch around noon, a sandwich and an apple. She sat on the newly repaired porch steps while he ate. "You do good work," she observed, running her hand over the smooth boards. "My father taught me. He said a man should know how to build things as well as break them down." Sounds like he was wise. He was, stubborn as hell but wise. Mason bit into his apple. "What about your father? How did he end up owning a saloon?" "He was a merchant in Kansas City before, owned a general store. But after my mother died, everything reminded him of her. He sold the store and went looking for something completely different. We heard Opal needed a saloon keeper, so here we are." She plucked at a thread on her apron. "I think he wanted to outrun his grief. I could have told him it does not work that way, but he needed to try. Did it help at all? Maybe. He stays busy, which is good, and we have made a life here. It is not the life I imagined when I was a girl, but it is ours." She stood and brushed off her skirt. "I should get back inside. We have a stew to prepare for tonight." Mason watched her go, admiring the practical way she moved, nothing wasted or showy. He returned to his work with renewed energy, wanting to impress her, though he would not have admitted it aloud. Over the next few days, Mason fell into a comfortable routine. He worked on repairs during the day, ate meals in the saloon, and spent his evenings in the common room, sometimes playing cards with the regulars but mostly just observing. Grace was always there, moving through the space like a dancer who had memorized every step. He learned her patterns, the way she tucked that stray piece of hair behind her ear when she was tired, how she bit her lower lip when she was calculating figures at the end of the night. They talked whenever she had a spare moment, conversations that started surface level but gradually went deeper. She told him about her childhood in Kansas City, about her mother who had loved gardening and singing, about her dreams of maybe one day opening a restaurant of her own where she could cook instead of just serve. He told her about the ranch in Texas, about the years of drifting, about the strange emptiness of having no place that felt like home. "You miss it?" she asked one evening. They were sitting on the newly repaired back porch, taking a break from the heat inside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "The ranch, I mean." "Sometimes," Mason admitted, "but mostly I miss the idea of it more than the reality. It was too much for me to handle alone, and I did not know who I was yet. I was just a kid trying to fill my father's boots and failing at it. You were 17. You were supposed to be a kid. Tell that to the bank that held the mortgage." He shook his head. "I made the right choice selling it. I just wish I had figured out what to do next." "And 8 years later still figuring it out," something like that. He looked at her profile, the way the sunset light caught in her hair. "What about you? You ever think about leaving Opal? Grace was quiet for a long moment. Every day for the first year, I hated it here.
This story was
Hated
posted
the
on the channel
dust
The
and the
Rusty Saddle.
small-mindedness
Please
and
do
the
not
way
repost it
everyone
in
knew
any
everyone's
form.
business. I missed the city, missed my friends, missed the life I thought I would have. She drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. But it gets better. Or maybe I just got used to it, and my father needs me. I could not leave him here alone. That is a heavy responsibility to carry. Maybe, but it is mine to carry. She turned to look at him directly. Not everything worth doing is easy, Mason. He felt those words settle into him like stones dropping into a well. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead, and Mason realized that for the first time in years, he was not thinking about the next town, the next job, the next destination. He was just here in this moment, and that was enough. The days turned into a week, and Frank asked Mason to stay on a bit longer. There was always something else that needed fixing, and truth be told, Mason was in no hurry to leave. He told himself it was because the work was steady and the pay was good. But he knew the real reason had green eyes and a smile that made his chest ache. Grace seemed to enjoy his presence too, seeking him out during breaks, saving him the best portions at dinner, laughing at his stories about life on the road. Mason had never been much of a talker, but with her, the words came easily. She had a way of listening that made him want to tell her everything, all the thoughts he usually kept locked away. It was the middle of the second week when things shifted between them. Mason was repairing the shutters on the second floor, balancing on a ladder propped against the building. Grace brought him water and stood at the base of the ladder, shading her eyes as she looked up at him. "Be careful up there," she called. "We cannot afford for you to break your neck." "I have no intention of breaking anything," Mason assured her. He tightened the last screw and climbed down, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. He took the water gratefully and drank deeply. "That is the last of the shutters. What is next on the list? Actually, I think you have worked through most of the urgent repairs." Grace consulted a piece of paper she pulled from her apron pocket. "There are always small things, but nothing that cannot wait. My father has been talking about building a proper storage shed out back, if you are interested in staying on for that project." Mason's heart sank at the thought of leaving, but he tried to keep his voice neutral. "How long would that take? 2 weeks, maybe 3? That is a long time." "Yes." Grace looked down at the paper, not meeting his eyes. "You probably want to get moving north before the weather turns. Fall comes early in Montana, or so I have heard." "Grace." He waited until she looked up at him. "I am not in a hurry to leave." Something flickered in her expression, hope maybe, or relief. "No, no." He took a breath, deciding to risk honesty. "The truth is, I have been looking for a reason to stay since about the second day I was here." "Why?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Mason could deflect, make a joke, keep things light and safe, or he could tell her the truth and see what happened. He chose truth. "Because of you. Because talking to you is the best part of my day. Because when I think about riding out of Opal, something in my chest feels wrong, like I am leaving something important behind." He set down the water cup, his hand suddenly needing something to do. "I know I am just a drifter with no prospects and no future to offer anyone. I know you probably have men in this town who are more established, more reliable. But I like you, Grace. More than I have liked anyone in a very long time." Grace's cheeks had turned pink, but she did not look away. "There are no other men. There have been a few who asked, but I never felt anything for them. They were nice enough, but there was no spark, nothing that made me want to say yes." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "And then you rode into town looking exhausted and lost and determined not to need anything from anyone. And I thought," Here is someone who understands what it means to keep going even when you are tired. Here is someone who has known loss and loneliness. Here is someone I want to know better. Mason's breath caught in his throat. Grace. I like you too, Mason. I have been trying not to because you said you were just passing through and I did not want to get attached to someone who was going to leave. But I think it might be too late for that. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted. But she did not move, just watched him with those remarkable eyes. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Her skin was soft and warm, and when she leaned into his touch, he felt something in him settle, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle he had not realized was incomplete. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. "I suppose that depends. Are you still planning to leave?" Mason thought about Montana, about the vague notion of ranch work that had been pulling him north. Then he thought about Opal, this dusty little town that had nothing to recommend it except for the woman standing in front of him. It was not a difficult choice. "No," he said, "I am not leaving." "Not unless you want me to." Grace smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "I definitely do not want you to." He leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful, a question more than a statement. She answered by rising on her toes and kissing him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the taste of her lips, the feel of her body against his, the thundering of his heart in his ears. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably talk to your father." "Probably," Grace agreed, though she made no move to step away. "He likes you, I think. You work hard and you treat people with respect. That matters to him." "I like him too, and I promise you my intentions toward his daughter are entirely honorable." "How disappointing," Grace teased, then laughed at his shocked expression. "I am joking, Mason, mostly." They stood there for another moment, neither wanting to break the spell. Finally, Grace sighed and stepped back. "I should get inside. We have customers arriving soon. But later, after we close, we can talk more. Figure out what this means, what happens next." "I would like that." She squeezed his hand once and then was gone, disappearing into the saloon. Mason stood in the empty street, touching his lips and wondering how his entire life had changed in the span of a single conversation. He had ridden into Opal with no plans to stay, and now he could not imagine being anywhere else. That evening, after the last customer had stumbled out into the night, Mason approached Frank behind the bar. Grace was upstairs tidying the rooms, giving them privacy for this conversation. "Frank, I need to speak with you about something." The older man looked up from the glass he was polishing. His expression was unreadable, but Mason thought he saw a glimmer of knowing in his eyes. "I figured you might. Have a seat." Mason sat on one of the bar stools, suddenly nervous in a way he had not been since he was a teenager. "I care about your daughter, a great deal. And I would like your permission to court her properly if she is willing." Frank set down the glass and studied Mason for a long moment. "You told me when you first arrived that you were just passing through. What changed?" "I met Grace. And I realized that I have been running from place to place looking for something without knowing what it was. Turns out it was not a place at all. It was a person." "Pretty words," Frank said, though his tone was not unkind. "But I need more than pretty words. My daughter deserves stability, Mason. She deserves a man who will stay when things get difficult, who will build a life with her instead of running off chasing the next horizon. Can you be that man?" Mason met his gaze steadily. "I can. I know my history does not support that claim, but I am asking you to give me a chance to prove it. I want to stay in Opal. I want to build something here. And more than anything, I want to be worthy of Grace." Frank was quiet for a long time, his weathered face thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. Grace is a grown woman who can make her own choices. If she wants to be courted by you, I will not stand in the way. But understand this, I will be watching. If you hurt her, if you make
This story
promises
was
you do
posted
not
on the
keep,
channel
you
The
will have
Rusty
me to answer
Saddle.
to.
Please do not
Are we
repost it
clear?
in any form.
Perfectly clear, sir. And I appreciate your trust. I will not betray it. See that you do not. Frank's stern expression softened slightly. For what it is worth, I do think you are a good man, Mason. You work hard, you are honest, and I have seen the way you look at my daughter. Just do not make me regret giving you this chance. I will not, I promise. They shook hands across the bar, a pact sealed. Mason felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it was a good weight, grounding rather than burdensome. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for, worth staying for. Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression questioning. Mason smiled and nodded, and he saw relief wash over her face. She came down quickly and joined them. "So," she asked, looking between the two men, "so your father has agreed to let me court you, if that is what you want." "It is definitely what I want." Grace glanced at her father. "Thank you, Papa. Just be smart about it," Frank said gruffly. "And no funny business under my roof. I may be giving my blessing, but I am still your father, and some rules remain in place." Grace rolled her eyes affectionately. "Yes, Papa, we will be the picture of propriety. See that you are." Frank picked up another glass to polish, signaling that the conversation was over. "Now both of you get out of here. It has been a long day, and I want to close up." Mason and Grace stepped out onto the front porch, now solid under their feet thanks to his repairs. The street was empty and quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in small towns late at night. A three-quarter moon hung overhead, casting silver light over everything. "Walk with me," Grace asked, holding out her hand. Mason took it, marveling at how perfectly her fingers fit between his. They walked down Main Street, past the general store and the bank, past the church with its modest steeple, past the handful of houses where families slept. They did not talk much, content just to be together, to feel the reality of this new understanding between them. They ended up at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. In the distance, the mountains rose like shadows against the sky. Mason pulled Grace close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, her back against his chest. She leaned into him with a sigh. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said softly. "I am thinking that 3 weeks ago I was alone and aimless, and now I am neither of those things. I am thinking that I rode into Opal expecting nothing and found everything. I am thinking that I am the luckiest man in Wyoming." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "I am thinking the same things. Well, the luckiest woman in Wyoming, but you understand the sentiment." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. When they finally pulled apart, Grace rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "What happens now?" she asked. "You cannot work at the saloon forever fixing things." "No, but I can find other work." "Opal has ranches nearby," you said. "Maybe I can hire on as a ranch hand, or I could see if any of the shops in town need help. I am a hard worker, Grace. I will find something." "I know you will." She pulled back to look up at him. "And in the meantime, you are welcome to stay at the saloon. My father already offered to let you keep the room in exchange for maintenance work and helping out when we are busy. That is generous of him. He is a generous man when he wants to be, and I think he sees that you make me happy. That matters to him more than anything." She smiled. "You do make me happy, Mason, happier than I have been in a long time. You make me happy too. You make me want to be better, to build something lasting." They stood there under the stars, holding each other, making quiet promises about the future. Eventually, they walked back to the saloon hand in hand, knowing that everything had changed and that the change was good. The next few weeks passed in a golden haze. Mason took on the project of building the storage shed, working steadily through the warm, late summer days. Grace continued her work in the saloon, but now she did it with a lightness that had not been there before. Whenever they had spare moments, they were together, learning each other, building the foundation of something real. Mason made it a point to be useful beyond his carpentry work. He helped Frank with heavy lifting, fixed things around the saloon before they broke, and even stepped in to help break up fights when the Saturday night crowd got too rowdy. He proved himself reliable and steady, exactly the kind of man Frank wanted for his daughter. The townspeople began to accept Mason as a resident rather than a visitor. The owner of the general store, a friendly woman named Mrs. Henderson, started greeting him by name. The blacksmith, a taciturn man called Peterson, nodded to him in the street. The Methodist minister invited him to Sunday services. Slowly, Opal was becoming home. Mason and Grace courted properly, with all the old-fashioned formality that Frank insisted upon. They took walks in the evening, attended church socials together, and shared meals at the saloon. Frank chaperoned more often than not, though he had the decency to sit far enough away to give them the illusion of privacy. It was during one of these chaperoned evenings, about 6 weeks after Mason had first arrived in Opal, that Grace told him about her dreams. They were sitting on the back porch again, a favorite spot of theirs, watching the sunset paint the sky. "I have been saving money," she said quietly. "Every spare penny I can manage. I have nearly $200 put away." Mason whistled low. "That is a considerable sum." "What are you saving for?" "A restaurant. A real one, with tablecloths and proper china and food that people choose from a menu instead of just eating whatever we cook that day." Her voice carried a wistfulness that made his heart ache. "I know it is probably foolish. Opal is too small to support something like that, and I should be practical, but I cannot help dreaming about it." "It is not foolish," Mason said firmly. "Dreams are what keep us going, what make life worth living, and I think you would run an excellent restaurant." "You are just saying that because you are courting me." "I am saying it because it is true. Grace, you are one of the most capable people I have ever met. You work harder than anyone I know, you are organized, you understand people, and from what I have tasted of your cooking, you are talented in the kitchen. If anyone could make a restaurant succeed in a place like Opal, it would be you." She looked at him with such hope and gratitude that he wanted to promise her the world. "Do you really think so?" "I know so. And maybe Opal is growing. Maybe the mining will pick back up, or the railroad will extend a line through here. Towns change, Grace. They grow or they shrink, but they change. And if you have the money saved and the opportunity presents itself, you should take it. Would you help me? If I did try to open a restaurant, would you be there with me?" Mason took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I would be honored to help you in whatever way you need. We could be partners if you want. Your vision and my labor. I may not know much about running a restaurant, but I can build whatever you need, fix whatever breaks, and support you every step of the way." Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Mason Lawson." The words hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying. Mason felt his heart stutter in his chest. He had never said those words to a woman before, had never felt them with such certainty. But he felt them now, burning in his chest like a fire that would never go out. "I love you too, Grace. I think I have loved you since the first moment I saw you carrying that tray through the saloon like you owned the world." She laughed, a sound of pure joy, and kissed him. They heard Frank clear his throat loudly from inside, a reminder that he was there and paying attention. They broke apart, both smiling. "Your father has excellent timing," Mason said wryly. "He has had years of practice," Grace replied. "But I do not mind. We have time, Mason." We have all the time in the world. As autumn approached, Mason knew he needed to make a more permanent commitment to Opal and to Grace. He
This
had been
story
living
was
day to
posted on the
day,
channel The
taking
Rusty
on
Saddle.
odd jobs
Please do
around
not
town to
repost it in any
supplement his
form.
work at the saloon. But if he was going to truly plant roots here, he needed something more substantial. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Henry Burke, one of the brothers who had been arguing that first night in the saloon, approached Mason one afternoon while he was working on the storage shed. "You are the carpenter fellow, right?" Henry asked without preamble. "I can do carpentry, yes, among other things. My brother and I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. We need someone who can handle general work, repairing fences, maintaining buildings, working with the animals when needed. It is not glamorous, but it is steady work and pays $30 a month plus room and board. You interested?" Mason paused in his sawing. $30 a month was good money, better than he had made in years, and ranch work would give him a solid foundation to build on. "I would need to board in town, not at the ranch. I have obligations here." Henry shrugged. "Fine by me. We just need someone reliable who will show up and do the work. Can you start next week?" "Yes, I can start next week." They shook on it, and Henry walked away without further conversation. Mason returned to his work, a smile playing at his lips. With steady income, he could start saving money himself, start planning for a real future with Grace. That evening, he told her about the job over dinner. Her face lit up with excitement. "Mason, that is wonderful. The Burke brothers can be difficult, but they run a good operation. And $30 a month, that is excellent pay. It means I can start contributing properly, maybe save up for a house of our own eventually." Grace set down her fork, her expression suddenly serious. "Are you thinking that far ahead? About a house? About us having a home together?" Mason realized what he had implied and felt heat rise to his face, but he did not back down from it. "Yes, I am thinking that far ahead. Grace, I know we have only been courting for a couple of months. I know by all rights I should wait longer before saying this. But I do not want to spend my life with anyone else. I want to marry you if you will have me." The entire saloon seemed to go quiet, though rationally Mason knew the other patrons were still talking and eating and conducting their business. But in his awareness, there was only Grace, only the way her eyes widened and her lips parted in surprise. "Are you proposing to me right now, in the middle of my father's saloon, covered in sawdust and without a ring?" "I suppose I am. Not very romantic, I know. I should have planned it better, made it special." "It is perfect," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "And yes, Mason, yes, I will marry you. I want nothing more than to be your wife, to build a life with you, to face whatever comes together." Mason stood and pulled her to her feet, kissing her right there in front of everyone. Frank came out from behind the bar, looking like he wanted to be stern but could not quite manage it. "I suppose I should have expected this," he said. "You two have been circling each other like planets since the day he arrived." "Are you upset, Papa?" Grace asked, still holding onto Mason's hands. "Upset? No, worried about losing my best worker. Maybe." Frank tried to maintain his gruff expression but failed, breaking into a smile. "Congratulations to both of you. Mason, you take care of my girl. Grace, you keep him in line. And for heaven's sake, someone get this man a ring before the whole town starts gossiping." The other patrons had caught on to what was happening, and a cheer went up. Drinks were poured, toasts were made, and the evening turned into an impromptu celebration. Mason sat with his arm around Grace, feeling more connected to this community than he had to any place in his adult life. These people, this town, this woman beside him, they were his now, and he was theirs. The next day, Mason rode out to a ranch on the far side of Opal, where an old rancher named Thomas Granger was rumored to have a collection of items left behind by previous owners of the property. Mason explained his situation, and Mr. Granger rummaged through a trunk in his barn until he produced a simple gold band. "It was my grandmother's," the old man said, holding it up to the light. "Been sitting in that trunk for 20 years at least. You can have it for $5, and I think that is more than fair." It was more than fair. It was a gift. Mason paid the man gladly and rode back to town with the ring wrapped carefully in his handkerchief. That evening, he proposed again properly this time, getting down on one knee in the back garden behind the saloon where Grace grew herbs for cooking. She cried when she saw the ring, and when he slipped it on her finger, it fit as if it had been made for her. They set the wedding date for mid-October, giving them 6 weeks to prepare. It would be a simple affair, conducted by the Methodist minister with a reception in the saloon. Grace insisted she did not need anything fancy, just the people she cared about and the man she loved. Mason threw himself into his new job with the Burke brothers, determined to prove himself valuable. The work was exactly what Henry had described, a mix of fence repair, building maintenance, and general ranch tasks. It was hard physical labor that left him exhausted at the end of each day, but it was good work, honest work. The Burke brothers were demanding but fair, and Mason appreciated their straightforward approach. He spent his evenings with Grace, making plans for their future. They would live at the saloon for the first few months while they saved money, then find a small house in town to rent. Eventually, they hoped to build something of their own, a place that was truly theirs. And beyond that stretched the dream of Grace's restaurant, always there on the horizon, waiting for the right moment. The wedding day arrived with brilliant sunshine and a crisp autumn wind. Grace wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair that Mason had picked that morning. Mason wore his best clothes, which were not much, but he had scrubbed himself clean and combed his hair with care. The ceremony took place in the small Methodist church, with what seemed like the entire town crammed into the pews. Frank walked Grace down the aisle, tears streaming openly down his face. Mason's own eyes were wet as he watched her approach, this remarkable woman who had chosen him despite all logic and reason. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices. They exchanged rings. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Mason kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause. They walked back down the aisle together, no longer two separate people but one unit, one partnership, one shared life. The reception at the saloon was loud and joyful. Frank had closed the place to regular customers for the day, transforming it into a party space. There was food, music from a fiddle player who lived on a nearby ranch, and dancing that lasted until late into the night. Mason danced with his wife, still marveling at being able to call her that, spinning her around the floor while she laughed with pure happiness. As the evening wound down and guests began to filter home, Mason and Grace slipped away to the room that would be theirs now. Frank had insisted they take the largest room, had even moved out some furniture to give them more space. It was not much, but it was a start. Grace closed the door behind them and leaned against it, looking at Mason with eyes full of love and anticipation and a touch of nervousness. "Hello, husband. Hello, wife." He crossed to her and took her hands. "Are you happy? Happier than I knew I could be, are you? Beyond measure." He kissed her softly. "I know I have not given you much, Grace. No fancy house, no security beyond what I can earn with my hands and my back. But I promise you this. I will work every day of my life to make you happy, to build something good with you, to be the man you deserve." You already are that man. And you have given me everything that matters, a partner who sees me, who believes in me, who loves me for exactly who I am. She reached up and cupped his face. We are going to have a wonderful life together, Mason. I know it. They made love that night with tenderness and care, learning each other in this new way, binding themselves together in the most intimate act possible. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking in whispers until sleep finally claimed them. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to share space and make decisions together, learning each other's habits and moods. But it was a sweet adjustment, full of laughter and discovery. Mason loved coming home after a long day at the Burke Ranch to find Grace waiting for him, loved sharing meals and stories and plans for the future.
This
Grace
story was
loved having
posted on the
someone to
channel The
care
Rusty
for,
Saddle.
someone who
Please do not
appreciated her
repost it in
efforts
any
and supported
form.
her dreams. They fell into comfortable routines. Mason worked 6 days a week at the ranch, taking Sundays off to attend church with Grace and spend the day together. Grace continued working at the saloon, though Frank had cut back her hours now that she was married, hiring a young widow named Sarah to help share the load. In their free time, Mason and Grace took walks around Opal, attended town socials, and saved every spare penny they could. Winter came to Wyoming with fierce determination. Snow piled high on the streets, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the basin overnight. Work at the ranch became harder, more about keeping animals alive and buildings intact than about repairs and improvements. Mason came home many nights with his fingers numb despite his gloves, his face wind-burned and raw. Grace always had the room warm for him, always had hot food ready, always greeted him with a kiss that made everything worthwhile. On the worst days, when the cold seemed to seep into his very bones, Mason thought about that first night he had ridden into Opal, exhausted and alone. He thought about how close he had come to just sleeping one night and moving on. The knowledge of what he would have missed made him hold Grace tighter, appreciate her more deeply. It was in February, 5 months after their wedding, that Grace made an announcement that changed everything. They were lying in bed one Sunday morning, luxuriating in the rare opportunity to sleep late. Grace had been quieter than usual for the past few weeks, and Mason had noticed but had not pressed, figuring she would tell him what was on her mind when she was ready. "Mason," she said, her voice carrying a tremor of nerves, "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her, suddenly worried. "What is it? Are you unwell?" "No, I am not unwell. Actually, I am perfectly healthy. It is just that." She took a deep breath. "I am going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby." Mason felt the world tilt on its axis. A baby. They were going to be parents. He was going to be a father. The enormity of it hit him all at once, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarse. "Yes, I am sure. I have suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. I spoke with Dr. Morrison yesterday, and he confirmed it. The baby should come in August." Mason pulled her close, overwhelmed with emotion. "Grace, this is wonderful. This is the most wonderful news. We are going to be parents. You are happy then. I know it is sooner than we planned. We have not even found our own house yet, and money is still tight, and I worried that maybe it was too soon, that maybe you would be concerned about how we would manage." "Stop," Mason said, pulling back to look at her face. "I am thrilled. Yes, it is sooner than we might have planned, but good things often are. We will figure it out, Grace. We will find a house, we will manage the money, we will do whatever needs to be done, because that is what we do. We face challenges together." Grace's eyes filled with tears of relief. "I love you so much. I love you too, both of you." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, marveling at the life growing inside her. We are going to have a family, Grace, a real family. They spent the rest of the morning making plans, talking about names and where the baby would sleep and how they would need to reorganize their lives. It was overwhelming, but it was also exciting. Mason felt a sense of purpose sharpen inside him. He had a wife to provide for and soon a child as well. He needed to work harder, save more, build something stable for them. The news spread through Opal within days. Frank was simultaneously thrilled and terrified at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. The townspeople offered congratulations and advice in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson started knitting baby clothes. Dr. Morrison provided Grace with instructions on how to stay healthy during her pregnancy. Mason increased his hours at the ranch, taking on extra work whenever it was offered. He also started accepting carpentry jobs on the side, building furniture and doing repairs for townspeople in his spare time. Every extra dollar went into their savings. They needed a house before the baby came, needed space for a nursery, needed to be settled. In April, opportunity arrived in the form of a small house on the edge of town. The previous owner had died, and his children, who lived back east, wanted to sell quickly. The house needed work, but the bones were solid. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room, and a small barn out back. The price was $150. Mason and Grace looked at their savings. They had $130 put together. Grace's $200 was reserved for her restaurant dream, and they had agreed not to touch that unless absolutely necessary. They were $20 short, and the children were not interested in negotiating. Frank provided the difference without hesitation. "Call it an early birthday present," he said when Mason protested. "You need a house, and this one is perfect for you. Take the money, buy the house, and raise my grandchild somewhere with space to grow." They purchased the house in May. Mason spent every spare moment repairing and improving it, fixing the sagging front steps, patching the roof, replacing broken windows. Grace cleaned every inch, scrubbing floors and walls until they gleamed. They moved in at the beginning of June, and the first night they spent in their own home, Mason carried Grace over the threshold despite her protests that her growing belly made her too heavy. "Tradition is tradition," he insisted, setting her down gently in the sitting room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson." Grace looked around at the modest space, at the furniture they had pieced together from second-hand finds and Mason's own building projects, at the curtains she had sewn herself, and smiled. "It is perfect." Summer arrived, bringing with it the heat and the promise of their baby's arrival. Grace grew rounder, her movements slower but her spirits high. She stopped working at the saloon entirely in July, spending her days preparing the nursery and taking care of the house. Mason worried about her constantly, rushing home each evening to make sure she was well. On a sweltering afternoon in mid-August, Grace's labor began. Mason fetched Dr. Morrison and then stood helplessly while the doctor worked, listening to Grace's cries of pain and wishing desperately that he could bear it for her. Frank arrived and sat with him, the 2 men united in their worry and their inability to help. It took 12 hours. 12 hours of pacing and praying and wondering if everything would be all right. And then, just as dawn was breaking, a baby's cry filled the house, strong and clear and perfect. Dr. Morrison emerged from the bedroom, tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mason, a healthy baby boy, and Grace is tired but doing well. You can go in now." Mason entered the room on shaking legs. Grace lay in the bed, sweaty and exhausted, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. When she saw him, her face broke into the most beautiful smile he had ever seen. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Mason approached carefully, as if afraid he might break something with a wrong move. He looked down at the baby in Grace's arms and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. The baby had dark hair like his, a tiny scrunched face and miniature hands that waved in the air. "He is perfect," Mason whispered. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Mason nodded, unable to speak. Grace carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the head.
This
The
story
weight
was
was
posted on the
almost
channel
nothing,
The
but
Rusty Saddle.
responsibility
Please
was
do not
everything.
repost it in any form.
Mason looked down at his son and felt tears track down his face. "Hello, little one. I am your father, and I promise you I am going to do everything in my power to be the best father I can be. I am going to protect you and provide for you and teach you everything I know, and I am going to love you for every single day of my life." The baby yawned, a tiny gesture that made both parents laugh through their tears. Grace reached out and took Mason's hand. The three of them connected in that moment, a family complete. They named him Matthew Franklin Lawson after no one in particular, just because they both liked the name. Matthew was called Matt from the beginning, and he became the center of their world. Mason had never understood the depth of love a parent could feel for a child until he held Matt in his arms. It was fierce and protective and all-consuming in the best possible way. The first few months were exhausting. Matt woke multiple times each night, needing to be fed or changed or simply comforted. Mason and Grace took turns, stumbling through the darkness to tend to their son, functioning on minimal sleep and maximum love. But neither of them complained. This was what they had wanted, what they had dreamed of, and the tiredness was a small price to pay. Mason cut back slightly on his extra carpentry work to spend more time at home, helping Grace with Matt, and with the endless chores that came with a baby. He still worked full days at the Burke Ranch, but his evenings now belonged to his family. He would come home, wash the dust and sweat from his body, and then spend hours holding his son, talking to him, singing to him, marveling at every tiny change and development. Grace blossomed as a mother. She was patient and nurturing, seeming to understand instinctively what Matt needed. She sang to him constantly, old songs her own mother had sung to her. She talked to him as if he could understand every word, telling him about his grandfather and his heritage, about the town he was growing up in, about all the adventures that awaited him. As Matt grew from an infant to a baby who could sit up and then crawl, the house filled with laughter. Mason built toys for him, simple wooden blocks and animals. Grace sewed clothes as he rapidly outgrew each size. Frank visited nearly every day, utterly besotted with his grandson, spoiling him with attention and small gifts. Life settled into a new rhythm: work, family, community. Mason joined the town council, contributing his labor to various projects that improved Opal. Grace became active in the church women's group, forming friendships with other mothers. They were planting roots deeper than Mason had ever imagined possible, becoming integral parts of the town's fabric. It was when Matt was 18 months old that Grace raised the subject of the restaurant again. They were sitting on the porch of their house one evening, watching Matt toddle around the yard chasing a butterfly. The sun was setting, painting everything in golden light. "I have been thinking," Grace said carefully, "about my restaurant dream. I know now is not the time, not with Matt so young and us still building our savings back up. But I do not want to lose sight of it entirely. I want to keep planning, keep preparing, so that when the time is right, I am ready." Mason reached over and took her hand. "I think that is a wonderful idea. What kind of planning are you thinking about?" "Recipes, mostly. I have been writing them down, testing them when I have time, and I have been observing what people order at my father's saloon, what they seem to enjoy most. I want to understand what would succeed before I risk our money on it." She paused. There is also a building that might become available. The old mercantile on 2nd Street has been empty for months. Mrs. Henderson told me the owner is thinking about selling it cheap, just to have it off his hands. It would need work, but the location is good and the size is right. How cheap are we talking? $200. Mason did some quick mental math. It was exactly what Grace had saved all those years ago, the money they had agreed not to touch except for the restaurant. So we could afford to buy it if the opportunity arose, but renovating it, equipping it, that would take more capital. I know, which is why I am not suggesting we do anything right now. I just want us to keep it in mind, to keep working toward it. She squeezed his hand. You told me once that dreams are what keep us going. I do not want to give up on mine. And you should not have to, Mason said firmly. We will make it happen, Grace. Maybe not this year or even next year, but we will make it happen. I promise you that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play, dreaming of the future. Mason thought about how far he had come from that exhausted cowboy who rode into Opal 3 years ago with no plans to stay. He had a wife he adored, a son who amazed him daily, a house they owned, steady work, and a community that accepted him. He had found the home he had been searching for his entire adult life, without even realizing he was searching for it. The years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons. Matt grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn determination. Grace continued working on her restaurant plans, refining recipes, and building a business strategy. Mason advanced at the Burke Ranch, eventually becoming the foreman, a position that came with more responsibility and better pay. When Matt was 4 years old, Grace announced she was pregnant again. This time there was no nervousness, only joy and excitement. They knew what to expect now, felt prepared in ways they had not been the first time. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in the spring of 1889 they welcomed a daughter into the world. Emily Grace Lawson arrived with a full head of dark hair and lungs that could wake the entire neighborhood. Where Matt had been a relatively calm baby, Emily was fierce and demanding from the start. But she also brought a new energy to the family, a spark of joy that enriched everything. Matt adored his little sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, bringing her toys, singing to her the same songs Grace had sung to him. Mason watched his children together and felt his heart might burst from the fullness of it all. This was family. This was legacy. This was everything that mattered. It was 2 months after Emily's birth that the mercantile building finally went up for sale. The owner had grown tired of paying taxes on an empty property and was willing to let it go for $150, a significant reduction from his original asking price. Grace and Mason discussed it long into the night, weighing the risks and opportunities. We have $800 saved now, Mason said, looking at their careful records. If we buy the building for $150, that leaves $650 for renovations and equipment. It would be tight, and we would be using nearly all our savings. I know it is a risk, Grace said. And if you think it is too much of a risk, I will understand. We have 2 children now, responsibilities. Maybe it is foolish to chase a dream when we have so much to lose. Mason looked at his wife, at the hope and fear warring in her expression. He thought about all the times she had supported him, believed in him, encouraged him to be more than he thought he could be. It was his turn to do the same for her. Buy the building, he said. We will make it work, Grace. You have been planning this for years. You know exactly what you want to do and how to do it. I believe in you and I believe in this dream. Let us build your restaurant. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Are you sure? I am absolutely sure. You are the most capable person I know. If anyone can make this succeed, it is you. And I will be right there beside you, helping in every way I can." They purchased the building the following week. Mason immediately began working on renovations, spending every spare moment transforming the old mercantile into the restaurant of Grace's vision. He built tables and chairs, installed a new cooking stove he bought from a closing hotel in a nearby town, repaired the floors, painted the walls. Grace worked alongside him when she was not caring for Emily, planning the menu, ordering supplies.
This story was posted on the channel The Rusty Saddle. Please do not repost it in any form.
The restaurant opened in September of 1889, 6 years after Mason had first ridden into Opal. They called it Grace's Table, a name that honored both the owner and the communal nature of sharing a meal. The opening night was packed with curious townspeople eager to see what Grace had created. Mason stood in the corner, holding Emily and keeping an eye on Matt, watching his wife move through her restaurant with confidence and grace. She greeted customers, took orders, ensured everything ran smoothly. The food was excellent, the service attentive, and by the end of the night, Grace had a reservation book filling up with return customers. It was not an instant success in terms of overwhelming profits, but it was a success in every way that mattered. Grace's Table quickly became a beloved part of Opal, a place where families celebrated special occasions and friends gathered for good food and conversation. Grace worked hard, but it was work she loved, work that fulfilled her in ways that simply serving at her father's saloon never had. Mason continued his job at the Burke Ranch, providing stable income while the restaurant established itself. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, he and Grace would sit together and go over the restaurant's accounts, planning and adjusting, always working together toward their shared goals. The years continued to pass in that good, steady way that marks a life well lived. Matt started school and proved to be a quick learner with a particular aptitude for mathematics. Emily grew into a spirited little girl who asked endless questions and climbed every tree she could reach. The restaurant became profitable, allowing them to pay down debts and start saving again. Mason built an addition onto their house, adding another bedroom and expanding the kitchen. Frank's health began to decline, and he eventually sold the saloon, moving in with Mason and Grace so they could care for him properly. It was in the winter of 1893, 10 years after Mason had first arrived in Opal, that Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep. The entire town mourned him, attending his funeral in numbers that overwhelmed the small church. Grace grieved deeply, but she also found comfort in the knowledge that her father had lived his final years surrounded by family and had seen his daughter build a successful business and raise 2 wonderful children. He had died happy, and that mattered. Matt was 9 years old by then, Emily 5. They mourned their grandfather in the way children do, with genuine sadness mixed with the resilience of youth. Mason helped Grace through her grief, holding her on the nights when she cried, listening when she wanted to share memories, giving her space when she needed solitude. Their marriage had grown deeper over the years, moving beyond the initial passion into something more solid and enduring. They were partners in the truest sense, facing life's challenges and joys together. The restaurant continued to thrive. Grace expanded the menu, hired additional staff, and even began catering special events around town. Mason eventually left the Burke Ranch to work full-time helping Grace run the business, handling the administrative side and the physical maintenance, while she focused on the cooking and customer relations. They made a formidable team, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. When Matt was 14, he started helping at the restaurant on weekends, learning the business from the ground up. He had his mother's practical intelligence and his father's work ethic, a combination that promised great things. Emily, at 10, showed an interest in cooking and would often spend hours in the kitchen with Grace, learning recipes and techniques. Mason watched his children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness of time's passage. Matt was already nearly as tall as him, his voice deepening, his interests shifting toward adult concerns. Emily was losing her little girl roundness, becoming lanky and coltish. They were good kids, respectful and hardworking, and Mason knew that much of that was due to Grace's patient parenting and steady example. It was on their 15th wedding anniversary that Mason took Grace back to the spot where he had proposed, the small garden behind what had been her father's saloon and was now a boarding house. The garden was overgrown now, wild in a way it had not been when Grace tended it, but the bones of it remained. "You remember standing here all those years ago?" Mason asked, holding both of her hands in his. "You said yes to me when you had every reason to say no. I was a drifter with no prospects, and you took a chance on me anyway." "It was the easiest decision I ever made," Grace said softly. "I knew even then that you were the person I was meant to find, that you would be my partner in all things. I've tried to be worthy of that trust every single day. I hope I have succeeded. You have succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined." She reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle. "You gave me a home, Mason, not just a house, but a real home full of love and laughter and purpose. You supported my dreams and helped make them reality. You have been an amazing husband and an incredible father. I could not have asked for more from this life. It has been the greatest honor of my life to be your husband, to raise our children with you, to build this life together." When I think about that night I rode into Opal, tired and alone and planning to leave at dawn, I cannot believe how close I came to missing all of this. But you did not miss it. You stayed, and that has made all the difference. They kissed there in the overgrown garden, the same spot where he had first put a ring on her finger, and Mason felt the circle of their story closing in the most beautiful way. They were no longer the young couple full of dreams and uncertainty. They were middle-aged, with lines on their faces and silver threading through their hair, with children and a business and a life so full it sometimes threatened to overflow. But the core of it, the love that had sparked that first night in the saloon, that remained as bright and vital as ever. The years continued their steady march. Matt graduated from school and announced his intention to become a lawyer, inspired by books he had read and cases he had followed. It would require going to Denver for education, a prospect that both thrilled and terrified his parents. But they supported him as they always had, helping him prepare for the journey and scraping together the money for tuition. Emily, at 13, had become an accomplished cook, already creating her own recipes and talking about expanding the restaurant's menu. She had her mother's vision and creativity, combined with a boldness that was entirely her own. Grace began teaching her the business side as well, preparing her to potentially take over one day. Mason, now 43 years old, sometimes felt the weight of the years in his joints and the ache in his back after a long day's work. But he also felt profoundly grateful for every single moment. The scared, lonely young man who had drifted from town to town for 8 years had become someone solid and rooted, a pillar of the community, a husband and father and business owner. He had become someone his younger self would not have recognized. It was a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1898, 15 years after Mason first arrived in Opal, that he and Grace took a walk around the town. Matt was away at university in Denver. Emily was spending the day with friends. They had a rare few hours to themselves, and they used it to simply wander hand in hand through the streets they knew so well. "Look how much it has grown," Grace marveled. The town had nearly doubled in size over the years, adding new businesses and homes, even getting a telegraph office 2 years prior. When I first arrived with my father, it was barely more than a few buildings. Places change, people change. That is the nature of life. Mason squeezed her hand. But some things stay constant. I still love you exactly as much as I did the day I married you. More, actually, because now I know you in ways I could not have imagined then. I love you too. More than words can express. She leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked.
This story was posted
Do
on the
you ever
channel
think
The
about what
Rusty
would have
Saddle.
happened if you had
Please do
not
not
stopped here
repost
that
it in any
night?
form.
If you had just ridden through without pausing? I try not to think about it too much. It frightens me, honestly. I was so determined not to need anyone or anything. I could have easily convinced myself to keep moving, to push through to the next town, and I would have missed everything that matters. I am glad you stopped. I am glad you stayed. I cannot imagine my life without you in it. They returned home as the sun was setting, that golden hour that had always been special to them. They sat on the porch of their house, the house that Mason had repaired with his own hands, and watched the light fade from the sky. Somewhere in Denver, their son was studying law. Somewhere in town, their daughter was laughing with her friends. All around them was the life they had built together, solid and real and beautiful. Mason thought back to that dusty evening 15 years ago when he rode into Opal with $3 and no plan beyond getting a meal and moving on. He had been running from loneliness without realizing that what he really needed to do was stop running. He needed to take a chance, to open himself to possibility, to believe that he could have more than a saddle and a horse and an empty horizon. And then he had walked into a saloon and seen a girl with green eyes and honey-colored hair, carrying a tray like she owned the world, and everything had changed. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, noticing his faraway expression. "How lucky I am. How grateful I am. How if I could go back and tell that tired, lonely cowboy who rode into town all those years ago that this was waiting for him, he never would have believed it. And yet here you are, here we are, here we are," Mason agreed. He pulled her close, and they sat together as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children, all the moments big and small that had comprised their life together. The future stretched ahead of them, unknown and uncertain in the way that all futures are. There would be challenges still to face, sorrows still to endure, changes still to navigate. But they would face it all together, just as they had faced everything else. And that, Mason knew, was more than enough. That was everything. Years later, when Mason was an old man with more memories than days remaining, he would tell anyone who asked that the best decision he ever made was stopping for one night in a small town called Opal. He had planned to leave at dawn, to continue his aimless wandering, to remain alone and disconnected from anything that mattered. But he met a girl serving tables in her father's saloon. He met Grace, and he never left that small town again. That single choice, that one moment of exhaustion that led him through those saloon doors, had given him everything. A wife he cherished, children who made him proud, a business that thrived, a community that embraced him, and a home that anchored his soul. He had become the man he was always meant to be, but only because Grace had seen that potential in him, even when he could not see it himself. And when Mason drew his final breath many years later, in the house he had built for his family, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, his last thought was of that first night. Of tired muscles and $3 in his pocket and green eyes that had captured his heart in an instant. Of the girl who became his wife, his partner, his home. Of Grace, always Grace, His amazing grace who had made him believe in second chances and fresh starts and the transformative power of love. The traveling cowboy had finally found what he had been searching for all along. And in finding it, he had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures do not come from moving forward, but from having the courage to stop, to stay, to plant roots, to build a life worth living in a place worth calling home, and that was the greatest gift of all.